Hello, my friend. It's day four of our Tiny Parks Painting the Wilderness Challenge, where we're painting national parks, but teeny. Today, we're painting one of the most iconic, memorable national parks in the United States, Yellowstone National Park. And in particular, we're painting a teeny tiny little bison off into the distance because Yellowstone is known for bison. Now, if you've been painting with me for any length of time, you might know I don't paint animals very often. It's not a thing that I was naturally drawn to when I first started painting, though I am doing a little bit more. So, when we're painting something that we might not have much experience with, a good idea is to pair that something with a different subject that you do have more experience with. In this case, I've been painting landscapes for years. I love painting landscapes, so it seems like such a natural fit to try painting animals in landscape scenes. So we are doing the first important thing, which is bundling a new subject with another subject that we already know we like. And another thing we're doing is we're making it smaller. Not only is this landscape teeny tiny, but the bison is also teeny tiny. We don't have to paint a whole lot in order for it to look like an animal, in order to look like what we're trying to paint. We just have to imply the detail, and our brains will do the rest. So I'm gonna show you how to simplify, how to paint something that scares you. It definitely scares me, and we're gonna do it together in this Yellowstone scene. Diving into this scene from Yellowstone, where we're painting a teeny tiny little buffalo in a field with some mountains and trees behind it and a little stream in front. The most important thing that we are focusing on here, because there are so many elements to this scene and because we are painting on teeny tiny little papers, is that we're not trying to paint what we know. We know we're looking at a bison. We know we're looking at a field. We know we're looking at a river. What we're trying to do is paint what we see. So I'm going to talk more about that. First, we're going to start with a sketch where I'm going to paint one line to kind of separate the field from the trees, and then one kind of jagged line to separate the water from the field. So the water from the field is along the bottom, like the bottom third maybe, and then the line separating the field from the trees is about halfway up the page. I started sketching a very loose, blobby kind of bison with just like a head and then the hump of the body and then the little legs. It was too big. One thing when you're painting animals and you want to paint them with a big landscape is that it's almost always going to need to be smaller than you think it's going to need to be. I have learned this the hard way. So I started it over because I started sketching and it was just too big. The good thing for you, especially if painting bison is something you've never done before, is we're painting a teeny tiny bison. This is like 1/4 of an inch big, right? And so it's really just going to be a blob. And I'm going to show you my best practices for painting that. We're going to paint it almost last. So first thing I'm going to do, now that I have sketched out the general areas of what I want to paint, is I'm going to prep the scene by painting an underlayer. And the underlayer is going to go across basically the whole page. The first part of the underlayer is the sky. So I'm painting the top half of the page, yes, even on top of the bison, because I'm very carefully going to make sure that the blue stays toward the top of the page using the wet on wet technique. So the wet on wet technique is you get the paper wet first, so only the top half, get the paper wet first, and then you start at the top with cerulean, and then you gradually paint down, and you make sure that the paint doesn't it gradually fades kind of into white. And then we're going to do the same thing along the bottom for the river. And then while that river is still wet, just along the bottom left-hand corner and along the top where the river meets the landscape, I'm going to paint a little bit of gold ochre in there. I started to paint a little bit of green or like cerulean into the gold ochre too, and then I changed my mind because we're just doing an underlayer here. An underlayer basically just means we're putting down a layer of paint, of blurry paint, so that we have kind of a loose outline of where we need the paint to go, and also so that we can add more details on top, right? We don't need to add every individual blade of grass. We don't need to add every individual hair on the bison. All we need to do is make sure we're kind of approximating. That is part of the paint what you see, not paint what you know. Okay, then I also did a very, very light value wash of gold ochre across the landscape too, so the field where the bison is. Then I let everything dry, or you dry it with a dryer, and now I'm taking some green. This is Cascade green, though you could use sap green, you could use hooker's green, it doesn't really matter what green here. And I'm painting the area above the bison. I'm very carefully painting around the bison, so the bison is still dry. And this is going to be the forest. So I realized, though, as soon as I started painting, there's a mountain in the distance. There's a mountain there. And normally I would paint the mountain first because normally I would paint from back to front and from light to dark. The mountain is lighter in value than the trees because it's in the background. So, but because I forgot that, I'm just going to go ahead and add it. I'm just painting the very tip top of the mountain behind the trees, and no harm, no foul. That's totally fine. I'm doing it with a very slightly darker value of cerulean. I added a teeny bit of some kind of red in there, like quinacridone rose maybe, or opera pink, to make the cerulean just a little bit on the warmer side, meaning it's closer to violet than it is to green. But honestly, the mountain is just going to be, it's not at all the main point of the scene, right? It's just like a hint of a shadow of a mountain in the background, but I wanted to make sure to add it. So now the mountain and the base layer of the trees are dry. I'm going to take a teeny DIY foliage brush. If you didn't see how I made this brush, definitely check out the saguaro tutorial from a couple days ago. It's just an old round number 2 brush that I like fanned out on my table to make the bristles all like excellent for painting foliage, excellent for painting little lines of grass basically. And on top of the base layer of the trees, I'm just starting toward the bottom and brushing up, gently lifting up so that I get little teeny tiny lines. Now you can also just do that with a round number 2. You don't need a foliage brush to do that. Then I'm going back in and adding a little bit more blue to the trees. One important thing to note about landscapes generally is that the farther back you go, the more blue the layers look. And so because these trees are in the background, they're green, but they're going to look slightly more blue. Okay, now we're going to use the foliage brush again, and I'm just going to darken the front of the landscape and then create depth by making the grass at the beginning of the landscape where like the field meets the water. I want those blades of grass to be visible and slightly darker. So we're creating like a deconstructed gradient here, meaning that the landscape, the field that's closest to the bison, because the bison is in the distance, that's going to be really light. We're mostly going to leave that base layer alone. And then we're gradually going to get darker and darker. This is mostly still gold ochre, though I added some burnt sienna into the gold ochre to make it just like slightly more brown. It's going to get darker and darker the closer we get to the river. And then where the landscape meets the river, we're also going to paint some shadows underneath where the landscape meets the river. And then using kind of like a back and forth horizontal motion, which is the same motion that we used on the landscape too, to kind of make this like the sweeping movement in the grass, right? We're going to paint a reflection on the river. We don't even need the river to be wet at this point. It's okay to use the dry brush technique. Then we're going to darken up the shadows after we've painted that teeny little reflection. Now, as we're going, you might be thinking, wow, you're painting all of these really fast. In my brain, I am not thinking I'm painting grass. I'm painting a reflection. I'm painting shadows. And right now I'm darkening up the river to make it slightly more blue by adding a little more cerulean in those zigzag strokes, right? I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking, I see blue here. I see brown here. I see yellow here. The yellow is darker toward the front. It's lighter toward the back, right? I'm trying to paint what I see, not what I know. And that is one of the best tricks when I'm painting kind of complicated scenes like this one on a tiny piece, is to remember that I can imply detail. So I'm also painting, I'm using some gold ochre with a little bit of burnt sienna to paint some more visible blades of grass. Paint what I see, not what I know. It's okay for me to paint just a few blades of grass in the front, maybe a few blades of grass where the river meets the landscape, and then let that be good enough for my brain to fill in the gaps. Then, to kind of tighten this up, especially if you're trying to separate different pieces of a scene together without going too overboard with the details, add just a little bit more dark shadows. That is one of my best tips also, especially in the foreground. So the shadows where the river meets the landscape, we want those to just be a little bit darker. And because we paint light to dark, right? That's why we started with the base layer, and then we started adding a few more wet on dry strokes with a little more color, and then a little even more. So, but by the time we get to the shadows, the darkest shadows, you don't need that much. Just a little bit, just a few more blobs of shadow along the river, and that's going to be fine. Next, we're going to paint the bison. So the bison we're going to paint in a couple layers. The first is burnt sienna. So the burnt sienna has a little bit of water in it. And then before it dries all the way, I'm just going to rub a little bit, like lift a little bit of the burnt sienna off of the middle of the bison, because we're just basically painting this as a value study. We're starting with the burnt sienna, lifting a little bit so that we have like a highlight there. And then we're just going to add the shadows around the head and around the legs so that we leave a little bit of a highlight along the top, but then and we still have a little bit of that burnt sienna layer that we see, but then the rest is in shadow. So we can still see 3 different colors of brown, right? And to make that burnt sienna slightly darker, I just added a little indigo to it. We're not trying to paint this very detailed bison. We're just trying to paint the values that we see on the bison. And one of the best ways to do that is to start with a light layer and then add shadows on top of that to just kind of add to the contrast is going to provide depth to the bison, even though we're really not painting it that much. Then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some slightly darker green along the bottom of the tree line, once again to add a little bit more depth. The trees are in the distance, so I don't need that much more depth. I don't need that much detail. It's okay to have that one be just a little more flat than the foreground scenes. Because the name of the game here, right, is like we're simplifying the background layers and we're simplifying the foreground layers too, but the most detail is going to be in the foreground. So we spent the most detail on that strip of land, right? That strip of land where the land meets the river. That's where the most detail is. It's where we can see the reflection. It's where we can see the shadows. We've built up like a light gold ochre, a medium gold ochre, and a slightly darker value gold ochre. And remember, the way that you darken a color like gold ochre that isn't actually really dark, you add more pigment to the mix. So the water to pigment ratio is higher on the pigment side. And then if you want it to look a little more brown, you add burnt sienna, maybe you add a little bit of indigo, and that's how you do it. So overall, it might be really intimidating because once again, we're painting a lot of things here. We're painting a mountain, we're painting trees, we're painting a bison, we're painting grass, we're painting a river, right? And that's one of the reasons why Yellowstone is such a beloved national park in the United States, because there is so much to see, so much vibrant wildlife, and you can paint that in teeny form by remembering that we're not trying to paint what we know, we're trying to paint what we see. We see little splashes of color. We see a little blob of shadow. We see, it's more blue at the top, then it gradually gets lighter. And so focus on that more than painting what you know. Like, forget that you're trying to paint a bison. Forget that you're trying to paint a landscape or you're trying to paint a reflection. Just put paint where, like, try to match it in your painting where you see it in the photo, but then simplify. So you do it in a way that feels doable for you. Okay, what did I love and what did I learn? I really loved the reflection and like just that little area between the landscape and the river. I didn't expect that I would, but I think, and I especially think darkening up the shadows just a teeny bit added a lot. What did I learn? Well, if you're afraid to paint something like a bison, like animals in your landscape, simplify it. Turn it into just a value study. Start light and then just add a little bit of shadow and let your brain fill in the rest of the detail. You really don't have to be a camera, right? We're painters. We can be artists. It's okay that our paintings look like paintings, especially if it helps you be in the moment even more. So thank you so much for painting with me, my friend. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did, and I will see you again soon.